You are a tenant and you have a landlord that is always intimidating you. He always threatens to eject you from his property. He's a pain in the neck. In our local parlance, we say, your landlord no gree you drink water drop cup. Every time he comes around, it is one problem or the other. You paid for a year and he's saying he will eject you anytime he so wishes. What a problem. Or on the other hand, you are a landlord, you have a tenant that is giving you a problem. He's a problem to the other tenants in the house. And you want to eject him, but you don't know the way possible to do that. Don't worry. In Yoruba, we say farabale. In Hausa, we say kwantar da hankalinka. In Igbo, we say we tobi. I will give you a solution to all these problems. And then you will find a way and a better option how to go about this. We'll be discussing the relationship between the landlord and the tenants today, and the quick notices a landlord is supposed to serve on a tenant before he ejects a tenant from his property. Hold on, click on the subscribe button and click on the like button as well as we go on. You're welcome. My name is AI Ango. I'm a legal practitioner, a notary public, and a chartered arbitrator. On the table today, we'll be discussing the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. The requisite notice a landlord must serve on a tenant he intends to eject lawfully from his premises. Before we delve into this discussion very deeply, we will have to understand some terms we will be using often in this discussion. First, who is a landlord? A landlord is that person who owns a property and gives that property out for rent or to somebody to stay in it. Who is a tenant? A tenant is that person who pays a specific amount of money to the landlord in order to stay in the premises belonging to a landlord for a specific period of time. What is a rent? A rent is that money the tenant pays to the landlord so that he can stay in that premises belonging to a landlord for a specific period of time. Now, tenancy is a relationship that is created once the tenant pays his money to the landlord so that he can stay in that period for a specific period of time. There are different forms of tenancy or different forms of tenants in an premises. First, we have a tenant at will. We have the weekly tenant. We have the monthly tenant. We have the quarterly tenant. And we have a tenant for 6 months. We have a yearly tenant. And then we have lease. What is tenant at will, or who is a tenant at will? A tenant at will is that person that the landlord allows or authorizes to stay in his premises free without paying anything as rent. The landlord decides to help or decides to allow that person to stay in occupation or to stay in that premises for a period of time for free. That is a tenant at will. A weekly tenant is that tenant that pays or renews his tenancy every week. This is not common in Nigeria, but in other climes, it is very regular. It's a regular practice where you renew your rent every week. You pay your rent every week. After 7 days, you renew your rent. Then the monthly tenant is that tenant who renews his rent every month. The quarterly tenant is that tenant who pays his rent every quarter. If he's a 6-month tenant, as the name is implied, he is to renew his rent after every 6 months. So in a year, the 6-month tenant will renew his rent twice. A yearly tenant is that tenant that pays his rent at the end of the year preceding the new tenancy. While a lease is that tenancy that lasts for a longer period, maybe 10 years, 15 years, 20, 25 years. That is a lease. Now, what are the required notices a landlord must serve a tenant if he intends to eject that tenant from his premises? There are two requisite notices that a landlord must serve a tenant. Let's take, for example, if the tenant is a yearly tenant. The landlord must serve that tenant the 6 months notice, as well as the 7 days owner's intention to take possession of vacant premises. Let's look at the tenant at will first. The tenant at will, if the landlord intends to eject that tenant, he only needs to serve him 7 days notice. 7 days notice is what the law requires him to do. Then, if he is a weekly tenant, the landlord only needs to serve him 7 days notice as well. If he is a monthly tenant, the landlord is expected or must serve him 1 month notice. If he's a quarterly tenant, the landlord also must serve him 1 month notice. If he is a 6 month tenant, the law said the landlord must serve him 3 months notice. 3 months notice. If he's an annual tenant or a yearly tenant, the landlord must serve him 6 months notice. If it's a lease, the landlord is expected to serve 6 months notice also. Now, this 6 months notice that the landlord is to serve, we must clear this misconception that some people are holding to your mind erroneously, that the 6 months notice is at the expiration of the rent. That is that's a misconception. The 6 month notice must be while your rent is still subsisting. For example, if your rent starts from 1st of January 2024, which is to terminate on the 31st day of December 2024, and the landlord intends to eject you from that premises, he is to serve you the 6 months notice on the 1st of July 2024 while your rent is still running. He can't serve you on the 2nd day of July. That is less than 6 months. So it must be 6 months, precisely 6 months. Though he can serve you more than 6 months, maybe sometimes in May or even in January he can serve you, but he must not serve you 1 day less of 6 months. If he mistakenly served a tenant 1 day less of 6 months, that notice will not stand. The tenant can argue it in court, and the court will surely set that notice aside. So, landlord must be very careful in that stand. You must be very precise. Let it be 6 months or more than 6 months. To be frank with you, the law protects the tenants much more than the landlord. So you must take all diligence, you must be very careful, and you must be very precise in that. So when you serve the 6 months notice and the tenant refuses to leave the premises at the expiration of his tenancy, what is expected of you is to serve him the second mandatory notice, which is the 7 days owner's intention to take possession of vacant premises, which we loosely call the 7 days notice. Now, if you serve the tenant the 7 days notice and still the tenant refuses to leave your premises, what will you do? That is when you need to go and get a lawyer, get the services of a legal practitioner, so that he will file the writ in court for you and go on with the legal tussle with the tenant. The reason being that You can file your case, landlord, on your own. But if you meet a stubborn tenant, he will surely want to frustrate the case for you in court. So that is the reason why you need a lawyer to help you with that rigor. It is advisable as a landlord, if you want to give out your house or your premises to a tenant, it is advisable for you to draft a tenancy agreement. It won't cost you much. Just give a lawyer to draft that for you. A tenancy agreement. Now, this lawyer will put in the conditions you want the tenant to abide by. The do's and don'ts that each party will abide by. Your rights and obligation, as well as the right and obligation of the tenants, will all be incorporated in that tenancy agreement. If that is done and both parties are satisfied with the conditions stated therein, then it can be executed. When we say executed in law, we mean both parties will sign. That is binding on all. Now, if you have a tenancy agreement, it will be easier for you now when you want to eject a tenant from your premises. If there's a tenancy agreement drafted by a lawyer for you, it will be easy for you. Once you go to court, you just look at the tenancy agreement, which of the conditions the tenant breached, and then you can use that and eject him out of your premises without much wahala. But sometimes some landlords think they are wiser, or they don't want to engage the services of a lawyer. They themselves too, they feel they know, and then they find themselves in trouble. So now, to the tenant, you also know that you have a right. A tenant can sue his landlord for trespass, because once you have paid your rent and your rent is still subsisting, the landlord must seek the permission of a tenant before he enters the property. You don't just barge into his property. You don't need to barge into his privacy because he's your tenant. No. The tenant can sue the landlord for trespass, and the court will surely grant him that. So you have a right as a tenant. The landlord cannot just come and eject you from the premises just like that. No. He must serve you these 2 requisite notices, and timeously, so that you will have your time to prepare. Now, where sometimes the landlord is trying to serve on the tenant these notices, and the tenant is evading service, he needs just to go back to the court. There will be a court bailiff who will come to serve the notices. And if the landlord or the tenant refuses to take that service, he just needs to go back and depose to an affidavit that they have served the tenant, but the tenant refused to accept service. That is all the court needs, and judgment will continue. Now, we need to understand that there are some tenants that will stay in the premises and they have rent that they have not paid. It's called arrears of rent. Now, the landlord can, when he goes to court to file his matter, he can also include that as part of the things, as part of his claims, as part of the relief he's seeking from the court. Arrears of rent. The tenant must pay those arrears of rent. Also, there is what is called the means profit. That is, after the expiration of the rent, and the tenant continued staying in that premises, thinking that because the matter is in court, he can stay and drag the matter for as long as he wishes, and at the end of the day, he will just go away. No. The landlord can also apply to the court that he is asking the court for means profit against the tenant. That is to say, the period the tenant stayed after his rent has expired, he must also pay. And if at the end of the day, judgment is given against the tenant, and he fails to pay the arrears of rent or the means profit, the court will come and evacuate all his properties that is in that house and take it to the court and dump it there. If after a time he still was unable to settle those the remaining profit and the arrears of rent, then the court will auction those properties and pay the landlord his money. If there's a balance, then they give it back to the tenant. But if there's no balance, then that is all. So don't think because the matter is pending in court, you can stay as long as you want and continue. There's nothing that is going to happen. No. The landlord can claim for means profit, and the court will surely grant him that. So you, as a landlord, you know that you have an obligation for your tenant, and the tenant also knows that they have an obligation to respect the landlord and to keep the property in good shape. These are things that must be incorporated in the tenancy agreement. This is the relationship that exists between the tenants and the landlord. We will urge you, don't get mad, just get a lawyer. Subscribe to this by pressing the subscribe button and like this, and also share with your friends. Thank you for watching. Drop your comments or questions at the comment box and we will respond to you promptly. You're welcome.